This episode contains discussions of death, resurrection, trauma, torture, assassination, violence, grief, psychological distress, loss of identity, survivor's guilt, and themes involving self-destruction and morality. Listener discretion is advised. Some people survived the storm. Sara Lance died in it, more than once. Before the League of Assassins, before the White Canary, before the legends. Sara Lance was just someone trying to escape. Escape expectations, escape pain, escape herself. But survival has a way of reshaping people long before they realize it is happening. A shipwreck turned her into a survivor. Violence turned her into a weapon. And resurrection turned her into something even more dangerous. Someone no longer certain where the darkness inside her ended and the real Sara Lance began. Because Sara Lance's story is not really about becoming a hero. It is about identity. About what happens when trauma keeps forcing someone to become a different person just to stay alive. And after enough loss, enough violence, and enough death, Sara begins asking the same terrifying question many survivors eventually face. Who am I now? And maybe the cruelest part of Sara Lance's story is that every version of her was trying desperately to survive the last one. Some people survive trauma once. Others survive it so many times they stop recognizing who they were before it happened. Welcome back to After the Storm, the series where we explore the survivors left standing after grief, catastrophe, violence, and impossible choices reshape who they are forever. This is not a show about perfect heroes. It is about people carrying scars long after the battle ends. The people trying to understand who they became while fighting to stay alive. And tonight, we're talking about someone whose life became a constant cycle of death and rebirth. An assassin, a survivor, a captain, a legend. This is the story of Sara Lance. Because Sara Lance's journey was never really about becoming the White Canary. It was about identity. About what happens when survival forces someone to keep reinventing themselves just to endure another tragedy. Every stage of Sara's life demanded that she become someone new. Survivor, killer, fugitive, hero. Until even she began questioning where the masks ended and the real person underneath began. Over the course of this episode, we'll explore Sara's transformation from reckless runaway to hardened assassin. The emotional consequences of resurrection and violence, her struggle with guilt and self-worth, and why her story ultimately became one of the most powerful narratives about survival in the entire Arrowverse. Because beneath the confidence, the sarcasm, and the strength people see in Sara Lance is someone who spent years trying to convince herself she deserved to keep living after everything she survived. This is After the Storm. To understand Sara Lance, you have to begin before the masks, before the League of Assassins, before the White Canary, before death became something she learned how to survive. Because long before Sara Lance became a legend, she was just someone trying to desperately escape her own life. Before Sara Lance became the White Canary, she was running. Running from expectations, running from guilt, running from herself. That is where Sara's story really begins emotionally, not with heroism or destiny, but with escape. Before the Gambit ever sank, Sara Lance already felt disconnected from the life around her. She lived in the shadow of expectations she never fully knew how to carry. Laurel was the responsible one, the stable one, the future everyone believed in. Sara became the reckless sister instead, impulsive, reckless, constantly searching for something to make her feel alive. And eventually, that recklessness changed everything. The affair with Oliver Queen became one of the defining emotional fractures in Sara's life, because it immediately ties her identity to guilt and self-destruction. Sara leaves on the Queen's Gambit not as a hero, not as a survivor, but as someone already emotionally lost before disaster ever struck. Then the ship sinks, and in one moment, the entire world Sara knew disappears beneath the water. That experience matters, because trauma rarely begins when people think it does. The island did not create Sara Lance's pain. It intensified wounds already buried underneath years of emotional confusion, impulsiveness, and insecurity. Survival simply stripped away every distraction hiding those feelings, and survival became very brutal very quickly. The Sara who emerges after the Gambit is no longer the same person. Every stage of her survival reshapes her identity, piece by piece. Captivity, violence, assassination, the League of Assassins. Sara adapts constantly because adaptation becomes necessary to survive. But the psychological cost of the transformation is enormous, because eventually, survival stops feeling temporary. It starts becoming who you are. That is one of the most tragic aspects of Sara Lance's story. She spends years becoming whatever the world around her demands her to be in order to survive another day. A fighter, a killer, a weapon. And after enough time passes, she begins losing confidence that the person she used to be even exists anymore. And yet, despite everything, Sara survives. Not cleanly, not perfectly, not heroically. She survives painfully. And that distinction matters because Sara Lance is not portrayed as someone untouched by violence. The trauma changes her deeply. It leaves scars on the way she sees herself, the way she forms relationships, and the way she processes guilt. Even after returning home, part of Sara still feels emotionally trapped inside survival mode, constantly expecting loss, betrayal, or death to arrive again without warning. And honestly, after everything she's endured, it makes sense why she struggles to believe peace is something meant for people like her. But Sara's story is not only about becoming broken, it is about what happens afterwards. Because eventually, survival alone stops being enough, and Sara Lance begins searching for something even harder, a reason to keep living beyond the pain. By the time Sara Lance returns home, she already feels like a ghost haunting her own life. And the terrifying part is, death was only the beginning. When Sara Lance returns to Starling City, she does not come home as the person who left. She comes back carrying death with her. That is what makes Sara's return so emotionally unsettling. Unlike many heroes who hide trauma behind a mask, Sara feels visibly haunted by everything she survived. Violence has become instinctive to her. Survival has become a reflex. Every moment of peace feels temporary because her mind has spent years conditioning itself for danger. And underneath all of that, Sara genuinely believes there is something broken inside her. The League of Assassins shaped Sara into someone deadly, but the emotional damage runs far deeper than combat training. The League stripped away identity, mercy, stability. It taught Sara to suppress fear, guilt, and grief, because hesitation could mean death. Over time, survival and violence became psychologically intertwined for her in ways she struggled to separate afterward. That creates one of the most painful contradictions in Sara Lance's story. She wants connection desperately, but part of her fears she is too dangerous to deserve it. That fear defines many of her relationships. Sara constantly worries that the darkness inside her will eventually hurt the people she loves. And honestly, after years of killing and surviving the League, she no longer fully trusts herself emotionally either. Then everything becomes worse, because Sara dies. And resurrection changed her permanently. The Lazarus Pit is not portrayed as a miracle. It is trauma amplified. Sara returns carrying rage, instability, and emotional fragmentation so severe that even she struggles to recognize herself. Death becomes something intimate to her story after that, not symbolic, personal. Sara experiences mortality in a way very few characters ever truly do, and surviving death forces her into an even more terrifying question. If you keep dying and becoming someone new afterward, which version of yourself is actually the real version? That identity crisis becomes central to Sara's evolution. She begins seeing herself less as a person and more as a collection of scars, mistakes, and violent survival instincts stitched together by guilt. Even when people around her see strength, Sara often sees damage. But what makes her story powerful is that she keeps moving forward anyway. Not because healing comes easy, but because eventually Sara starts realizing survival alone is not enough anymore. She wants purpose, connection, meaning. And slowly, through all the chaos surrounding her life, Sara Lance begins transforming from someone defined entirely by survival into someone capable of helping others survive too. For most of her life, Sara Lance believed she was a weapon pretending to be human, but somewhere along the way, the survivor became a leader. One of the most beautiful parts of Sara Lance's evolution is that her story eventually stops revolving around punishment. It starts revolving around healing. Not perfect healing, not easy healing, real healing, messy healing. Because when Sara joins the Legends, something fundamentally changes about her life for the first time in years. Instead of constantly being trapped inside cycles of guilt and violence, Sara begins finding people who understand brokenness the same way she does. Misfits, survivors, people carrying their own emotional wreckage through time and space while trying desperately to become something better than the worst things they survived. And for the first time in a long time, Sara starts to allow herself to belong somewhere. That matters because belonging is terrifying for survivors who spent years expecting abandonment or death. Sara's instincts has always been to stay emotionally mobile, never rooted long enough for a loss to destroy her completely again. But the Legends become a family in the strangest and the most important way possible. Not because they are perfect, because they are not. They are chaotic, damaged, reckless, emotionally complicated, just like her. And through that environment, Sara slowly begins rebuilding an identity outside of pain alone. That is where the White Canary truly emerges emotionally. Not as an assassin, not as a ghost, not as someone defined by death, but as a leader capable of guiding other broken people through their own storms because she understands survival intimately herself. Sara's leadership style is fascinating because it is built on entirely empathy disguised as toughness. She understands fear, shame, rage, self-destruction, which means she often sees humanity in people others would immediately give up on. Sara does not lead because she believes she is morally perfect. She leads because she knows exactly what it feels like to believe you are beyond saving. And over time, she slowly stops seeing herself that way too. That transformation may be the most important part of her entire journey. Sara Lance spends years believing survival turned her into a monster. But eventually, she realizes something deeper. Surviving darkness does not automatically make someone darkness itself. Sometimes, it makes them compassionate in a way other people cannot fully understand. And maybe that is why Sara Lance resonates so deeply with people emotionally. Because her story is not about becoming flawless after trauma. It is about continuing to live despite it. Continuing to love despite it. Continuing to trust despite it. Continuing to hope despite it. Even after death itself tried to take everything from her. That is not weakness. That is survival becoming strength. After everything Sara Lance survives, the violence, the deaths, the guilt, the endless reinvention of herself, one truth finally begins to emerge. Maybe survival was never the end of her story. Maybe it was the beginning. By the end of Sara Lance's journey, something remarkable happens. She stops defining herself entirely by what hurt her. That may sound simple, but survivors like Sara, it is one of the hardest battles imaginable. Trauma has a way of convincing people that pain is their identity, that survival becomes the only thing they are truly good at. For years, Sara Lance believed she was dangerous, broken, and permanently shaped by violence in ways she could never escape. And honestly, after everything she endured, that fear makes sense. But over time, Sara begins proving something important to herself. Broken people are still capable of building meaningful lives. That realization changes everything. Because once Sara stops viewing herself solely as a weapon, she becomes something far more powerful emotionally. Someone capable of creating a safety for other people. Throughout her time leading the Legends, Sara becomes the emotional center holding a team together, filled with chaos, trauma, and instability. Not because she has all the answers, but because she understands what survival actually costs. She understands guilt, fear, shame, loss, and because of that, she leads with empathy hidden underneath strength. That combination makes Sara unique. She is not hopeful in the same way Barry Allen is hopeful. Her optimism is quieter, harder earned. Sara Lance believes people can survive darkness because she herself has lived inside it and still found reasons to keep going on afterward. That is an entirely different kind of strength. And maybe that is why Sara Lance's story resonates so deeply with people emotionally. Her journey never pretends to healing is clean or linear. Sara lapses emotionally. She struggles with guilt repeatedly. She questions her worth over and over again. But survival stops being about merely enduring the pain. It becomes about choosing life despite it. Choosing connection. Choosing love. Choosing family. Choosing herself. Even after years spent believing she did not deserve any of those things. And honestly, that transformation may be more inspiring than any fight Sara Lance has ever won. Because the White Canary is not extraordinarily simple because she has survived death. She is extraordinary because after everything tried to destroy her humanity, she still chose to remain human anyway. And maybe that leaves us with the real questions surrounding Sara Lance. How many times can someone reinvent themselves before they stop recognizing who they were originally? Because Sara Lance spent years becoming whatever survival demanded she become. Survivor, assassin, fugitive, captain, legend. And somewhere inside all of those versions of herself was someone desperately trying to believe she still deserved peace after everything she had done and endured. But maybe healing is not about returning who you used to be. Maybe healing is learning how to live inside yourself beside the scars without letting them define your entire existence forever. And if that's true, then Sara Lance may be one of the strongest survivors the Arrowverse has ever created. Thank you for listening to After the Storm. If you enjoyed tonight's episode on Sara Lance, there are more storms awaiting ahead. More survivors, more tragedies, more people trying to understand who they became after the world changed them forever. And remember, surviving the storm does not always mean returning unchanged. Sometimes it means becoming someone new entirely and learning how to love that person anyway. If you liked Sara Lance, check out my other shows. The links are in the episode description. I also would appreciate if you checked out our other shows from our little group, like Fandoms and Hey Anime, and let them know I sent you.